So I'd like to introduce Sue. Sue Brookhart is a Ph.D. and education consultant based in the great state of Montana. Sue works in classroom assessment and consults to teachers, schools, districts, universities, and states. She's been a classroom teacher and a professor and a department chair in the Ed School at Duquesne University. Currently, she's an adjunct faculty member of Duquesne. Sue has authored or co-authored 16 books and over 70 articles. And we are thrilled to have Sue here. I'm going to hit stop broadcasting, Sue, and you can hit, and then I'll disappear and you hit start broadcasting.
I am. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's amazing to me that I'm talking to people halfway around the world. That seems really cool to me. I hope today that you're here to learn about creating and using effective rubrics. I have a lot of examples, so I'm going to just march through the slides rather quickly, and then there will be time for questions at the end. I guess the big idea for the whole presentation is both the student's performance and how you observe or score it, meaning usually the rubric, defines what kind of evidence you get from an assessment. So you could have a marvelous assessment with lots of evidence of student thinking, but if your rubric doesn't have any criteria that allow you to evaluate the quality of the student thinking, then once that lovely assessment, that student work goes home with the student, all you're left with is some rating of things besides the student thinking, like maybe how many facts they put in or whatever. If you're going to do that, you might as well give them a test. The rubric needs to really look at the quality of students' thinking and the substance of student work and not just count surface level features, or you won't actually get what you think you're getting out of a really rich performance task. Before we go too much farther, I want to clarify what I mean by rubric, because some people call any scoring scheme a rubric. Checklists, rating scales, point schemes, true rubrics, and I want to make sure that you know that in this webinar we're talking about true rubrics. So here's an example of a checklist, a rating scale, and a tiny but actually true rubric. I hope that you are looking at those now and trying to figure out which one is which. If there weren't 900 of you, I'd give you a little quiz on that, but there's too many of you to do that. The upper left-hand one is a checklist. It has criteria. In this case, it has 3 of them. But the rating or scoring is a present or absent decision. My sentence has a capital letter or it doesn't. Check for yes, or a Y for yes. The symbol doesn't matter. The idea is that you can just make a present or absent decision. The one in the blue there is a math problem solving at what some people would call rubric, but it's not. If you look at it, you'll notice that all it does is rate. So that if, for instance, you were good on describing what the problem was asking, there's no information in there that would tell you what to do if you wanted to be excellent at that. It's a rush to judgment. There are criteria. There are 4 of them there. But then what you do is evaluate. The little rubric at the bottom is indeed a little rubric, but it is a true rubric in that it has both criteria and performance level descriptions. The rubric says, did I reason from examples to arrive at a clear, accurate description of physical and chemical changes? This was a rubric that was applied to some work in a high school chemistry class. And notice that there are ratings there, 2, 1, and 0. We all know 2 is greater than 1, which is greater than 0. But you don't jump to the evaluation. The first thing you do is match the description with the student work. So you look at what the student did and you give it a 2 if and only if you can say that student work completely and clearly reasons from examples to arrive at a description of physical and chemical changes. There's clear evidence of reasoning. There are examples. Okay, then it's a 2. So it ends up with a rating, but it's not a rush to judgment. The principle that rubrics work on is that you match the description to student work, and then you get your rating. And the cool thing there is students can also use those descriptions. That's how come rubrics are good for both learning and teaching, as well as for grading. If you only wanted a new good way to score student work to give a grade, you wouldn't need to bother with rubrics. Any point scheme or traditional way of adding up points will arrive at a grade. The thing about rubrics is those descriptions that you and the students can use. That's the big deal. So, as I just said, true rubrics have both criteria and performance level descriptions, and that is a very big deal. Here is an example. You might want to use that maximize button because the print is tiny, but this is a very excellent rubric that was used with elementary school children. I think they were 5th graders, because the students were having trouble writing an explanation for their mathematical work. And if you notice, there are 3 criteria. In this case, the criteria are across the top: showing math knowledge, using problem-solving strategies, and writing an explanation. And in the class that this rubric was used in, writing an explanation was the one they were particularly working on. And so students had to rate their own work and conference with their peers and teachers, and they got better. All the students in the class, at all levels of achievement, got better at writing an explanation. Notice that the performance level descriptions in this one are written from the student's point of view. I write what I did and why I did it. I explain each step of my work. I use math words and strategy names, and so on. This is an excellent example. Not all rubrics are this good, but this is what you're aiming for. Now, think about that lovely rubric, and if you could have the slides together, you would notice that I have used the exact same criteria here, but I've created a rating scale, not a rubric. And I've used smiley faces. Now, I like smiley faces. They're cute and all. But notice that when you take the descriptions away, you knock the stuffing out of the rubric. If a student got a straight face under I can do the problem correctly and get the correct answer, there's no information here that would help them figure out what to do to get a smiley face. This is just another sort of example to show you that rating scales, excellent, good, fair, poor, smiley, straight, frowny, frequently, sometimes never, all of those that jump to ratings leave out information that make rubrics as useful as they are for both learning and assessment. So, what should criteria look like? They should be about the learning, not about the requirements for the assignment. That's a big one. I see lots of rubrics where basically the directions are the criteria. So, has 3 sources. Well, maybe it needs 3 sources, and maybe that should be on a checklist, and maybe you should not take the assignment if it doesn't have 3 sources. But the criteria should be about the quality of the sources, their relevance to the report, or something like that, something substantive, not just that there were 3 of them. The criteria should also be matched to the learning goal or achievement standard you want to measure a report on. So that means that you might choose to privilege some aspects of the assignment over others because you're giving that assignment, that assessment, in order to be an indicator of a particular learning goal or standard. So effective criteria are appropriate to the learning goal, definable. If a kid said, "What is this?" you should be able to not only say so, but show them examples. Observable, so a criterion should be something like explains the water cycle, not understands the water cycle, because understanding is something you have to drill a hole in a kid's head to get into and see. It's not observable in the work. What's observable is the explanation. The criteria need to be distinct from one another. There are some rubrics that suffer from the the problem that if you're a 3 in one thing, you're a 3 in everything. And in that case, the fact that there are separate criteria doesn't help you. It's just a complication you don't need. The set of criteria needs to be complete for your purposes, not complete in the universe. For instance, in a high school lab report, you might want students to use the King's English. But since you're actually using this for a science grade, you might not have a grammar and usage criterion, because that's not what you're assessing. That doesn't mean you can't assess it with feedback and say, you didn't write this very well. And can you do that better? I have had teachers say, well, I don't need to write a bottom category because nobody in my class would do that. Well, probably not, and that's good. But they still need to see what the range of performance is in order to judge their place in it. Performance descriptions need to distinguish among levels. If you're trying to write 4 levels and you keep ending up having 2s and 3s that sound exactly the same, that you can't really tell whether something's a 2 or a 3, then you've got too many levels. They also need to center the target performance at appropriate levels. So if you're in a system that has proficient and then has something above it called advanced, you need to make sure that whatever is described under the level proficient actually is what you would consider proficient. And then advanced would be something more than that. And it needs to feature parallel descriptions from level to level. Whatever you talk about in one level needs to be talked about all along. So maybe the top level might be a complete and clear explanation, and the next level might be a clear or adequate explanation, and so on. But something about the explanation goes all the way across. So here's an example that, again, if there weren't 900 of you, I'd have you tell me what's the difference. But notice that in the first one, and this, by the way, is not a whole rubric, it's just one criterion from a larger rubric, for an elementary school story writing rubric. Notice that the top one simply counts errors. People like that. It's easy to defend. When somebody says, why did I get a 3? You can say, there, you got 2 errors, you count them. But it's not a good way to rate student work quality. Better is to describe the substance of it. In the case of a story writing, the substance of grammar and usage is to advance your story, to get your readers to understand what you mean. And if you do that effectively, you're a 4, whether you have an error or 2 or not. The other issue with counting errors is, supposing one kid writes a completely error-free paragraph, but it only uses 1-syllable words and short, simple sentences. And somebody else tries for more advanced vocabulary and some compound and complex sentences, but drops a comma or 2. By this top rubric, you would have to say that the simple one is a 4, and the more advanced one is actually a 3, which is not actually a good representation of the quality that you're looking at. You get into trouble when you count things. There are a few times when you really do need to count things. Then don't use a rubric. In a keyboarding class, words correct per minute, just count. There it really does make sense to count, but not in a rubric. Go to substance. People don't like this. I have to drag them kicking and screaming, but I'm here to tell you that it will hurt students if you do it this way. And I may later on be able to prove that to you. Here is a poor example of one criterion from a science lab report. The good example's on the next slide because it's a big thing. But notice that they just describe a bunch of things they want the science report to have, and then back off at one at a time, which is sort of like a big extended checklist. Notice that the descriptions are not independent. You can't have a relevant title unless you've got some sort of question or hypothesis that you're testing. You can't have a testable hypothesis unless you've stated a hypothesis. So really, this rubric is more like 4-2-1 than 4-3-2-1. It just doesn't work. And we reworked it, And the criteria notice is now no longer just introduction, because it's not about having a paragraph in your report that's called introduction. It's about being able to state research question and set hypotheses. That's the real criterion. Notice that the characteristics are laid out on a continuum from good to poor, and that they're parallel all the way along. We talk about hypothesis in all three of them, even though in the one category they don't state one, you still make reference to what's up with that hypothesis, and that they mention the quality of the hypothesis and the title all the way through, parallel. And here's one more example of a poor and good comparison. The top one as the first example simply counts things. So what if a kid comes and does a George Washington report and wears his Mickey Mouse ears? He used a prop. What you want to do is say, did the props and visuals make any difference to that performance, that oral presentation, that wouldn't have been done if they hadn't had the props and visuals? And I know my example is social studies example here. The slide says science. Sorry about that. But supposing, for instance, a student dressed up like George Washington. Well, that'd be a little better. Supposing, though, that his point was that George Washington was an excellent general, also an excellent scholar, and an excellent lawmaker, and an excellent other things. And so he brought in a general's hat and an old science book and a copy of the Constitution, and used them at the appropriate places in his report. Now you're talking. Now those props actually do help with the report in a way beyond the words alone. Go for substance. Don't just count things. This is just another example of how criteria need to be relevant, and that the descriptions need to go in a continuum from good to poor. They describe the quality of, in this case, student singing, according to accuracy, text, tone quality, interpretation, and something that at this point I cannot read. Part work, singing parts, soprano, alto, that sort of thing. There are lots of good rubrics out there. There are also lots of horrible ones, and I hope that after this webinar you'll be able to tell the difference. This is, with many thanks to a teacher in Pennsylvania, going to be a before and after story. I thank her for allowing us to share her before and after rubrics. That was very brave of her. So there was an assignment in this third grade to describe the life cycle of any particular animal or critter that you described. The science standard, the Pennsylvania Science Standard said students will understand that animals have life cycles. And so she assigned a poster that was going to be her performance assessment. And here are the original rubrics. You will notice that two of the rubrics do not go to the science standard. There's nothing in the Pennsylvania Science Standards that says can title a poster. And there's nothing in the Pennsylvania Science Standards that say can make a neat appearing pretty poster. So criteria 1 and criterion 5 are inappropriate for this assignment. They're not inappropriate for the directions for the work. Teacher doesn't want to put a bunch of crap on her walls. They need to be pretty. They need to be titled, but you don't handle that by grading it in a rubric. Also, you will notice that there's some of those counting issues. Under illustrations of the life cycle stages, she's got one or two, more than two missing. It's not about how many pictures you have. It's about, are they the right pictures, and do they help the student show you what the life cycles of whatever animal they picked is. So here's what we did when we revised it. We revised the scale for reasons that aren't relevant here, but we kept the criteria that have to do with understanding the life cycle. We changed the wording in the performance level descriptions to be about the substance, not about the counting, so that each stage has an illustration that helps show what happened to the animal is proficient. If it's an exceptionally clear or detailed view, then it's advanced. Notice there is nothing advanced in the order of life cycle stages criterion, because to be proficient, you need to have them all in there, and there's not much more you can do than that. You can't make up another stage if it isn't there. So what about all those directions? What about all those directions? You put them on a checklist. You use them formatively. You have students either check their own, or you can check them. You can hand it back and say, this poster doesn't have a title. Put a title on it before I'll take it. Or however you want to handle it in your class. It's not that you don't assess those things. It's that you do not rate them on a rubric. And they don't go into a grade. Now here's my sad story, and I realize that's tiny, but that's the purpose of, don't read that rubric, it would just make you sad. This was a 7th grade class. The students had to do a biome report. And the categories for judging were all these surface level features. How many pictures they had, how many pictures of animals, how many pictures of plants, what their grammar was like, all of these things. And so here I have, this is the sad story. This will convince you, if my talking head won't, that this don't count things and don't put directions in the rubrics is because it harms students. So here is the 7th grade inclusion student, and he has it's 3 pages. He's clearly block and copied pictures from the internet and stuck them in his report. He has the requisite number. He has a map. He has 2 paragraphs of content. And the content describes the temperate forest biome fairly accurately, if not terribly long. The teacher loved it. 25 out of 27. Lots of 4s. Because the student did all these little directions things. Now here's another student who didn't. This student chose temperate grassland as the climate, as the biome he was going to describe. There are 2 longer paragraphs. If you could read them, you would notice they are more detailed than the previous students. There are a couple grammar errors that you can see the teacher has marked. But if you just read what this student wrote about temperate grassland, you get this feeling that this student understands a whole lot more about temperate grassland than the previous student understood about temperate forest. But look what happened. He failed. Because he didn't have pictures, which just amounted to not copying them off the internet. He had a couple of grammar errors, and since we're counting, the fact that his paragraphs were used longer sentences worked against him. And in any class I know about, 12 out of 27 is definitely a failure. And for what? For a student who, I submit, we have evidence understands temperate grasslands at least as well, and probably better, than the other student understood temperate forest. Why he failed was because the rubric gave too many points for surface level characteristics that had nothing to do with understanding. I see this over and over again. Now this is already a 7th grade inclusion student. He's already been identified with a learning disability. What's he going to conclude? Probably something like science sucks and I can't do it. And that's not actually true. He did the science. He just didn't follow all the little directions, which he should have done. But the cure for that isn't flunking him. It's giving it back to him and saying, can you find some pictures? Or whatever you need to do. It harms students when your rubrics count things and when they have unbalanced criteria so that you get most of your points for following directions and surface level characteristics. It's horrible. By the time I get these examples, the work is gone, the grade is in, I can't do anything about it, the damage is done. Now, sometimes rubrics can be very concrete. This is an example of a third grade that's learning that multiplication problems can be described many different ways. It's another poster. For some reason, posters make great examples to show because you can put them on a slide. It's not that I'm particularly partial to posters. So, the directions were to express a multiplication problem 4 different ways: as a multiplication problem, as repeated addition, as groups, and as an array. And this child did a lovely job. But technically, she should have drawn 9 groups of 3 instead of 3 groups of 9, but we'll let her slide on that. And the rubric was very straightforward. It just looked at each one of those representations to see if it was accurate, which is a perfectly straightforward way to go. There's nothing wrong with that. It can be concrete. But notice these aren't silly little surface features. These are actually looking at the substance of what she wrote for the multiplication problem, for the repeated addition problem, and so on. Now here's a kid who has the general idea, but if you actually count what he drew, he doesn't have equal numbers in all of his groups in those 8 groups of 10. Or is it 10 groups of 8? I guess it's 10 groups of 8. He doesn't have all the right number of stars in there. And the rubric reflects that. But that doesn't knock him out of it doesn't fail him. And if you look there, that actually is a kid who understands what it is that this multiple representations thing is going for. He just, when he started to make 10 stars in each box, he counted wrong a couple times. And the rubric reflects that. However, if you have more complex tasks, your rubrics do need to be more complex. And the criteria are more like qualities. Again, not about the directions, but. So here's an NCTM, National Council of Teachers of Mathematics rubrics. It's an old one, but that talks about mathematical problem solving. That describes students getting a correct answer or getting almost a correct answer with just a copying error or computational error, and not getting the answer, and so on. Here is an example of a question about combinations. And it's actually a 2-point question. I'm only going to focus on the first one. There are 9 people who choose. You can choose 3 kinds of ice cream and 3 kinds of containers to put them in. How many possible combinations are there? And then the second question, could another person have another choice that's different? Let's lay that aside for a minute. So here is somebody who clearly has a systematic approach, circles through all the vanillas, chocolates, and strawberries with all of the cones. So you have evidence in that answer that the student has a complete and correct understanding of the problem. So if you go back to our rubric, you can see how they decided to solve the problem. You can see their solution strategy in rotating the 3 different things, and they got the correct answer. Here is another kid. Now, he didn't answer the second question, but leaving that aside, it's a very different answer, but the solution is clear. The strategy is clear. He's rotating cone, bowl, sugar cone, bowl, waffle cone, sugar cone, waffle cone, bowl. He's alternating those, and he's alternating vanilla, strawberry, and chocolate ice cream. And he comes up with 9 as well, and the solution strategy is also in his answer. And that, too, would be a perfectly good way to do it, and it would show up okay on that rubric. And it's not just about showing up okay. It's a matter of this student really does understand what he's doing. He does know how to do combinations. If you can, you might consider a template. Now, this is not a rubric. This is a template. There's no criteria in it. It just talks about how you would describe it. So let's do that. Let's talk about an example of a 6th grade that was trying to write a well-structured paragraph in response to a prompt. Now, English teachers out there, I know there are lots and lots of other ways to write a paragraph. This teacher, this is a real example from a real teacher, she wanted them to write a paragraph that answers a particular question with a focus or topic sentence, which later on in their careers will turn into thesis sentence, I think, supports the topic sentences with details, and then has an ending sentence. Again, not the only way to write a paragraph, but that's what she wanted. So here is a holistic rubric that takes those criteria and uses them in holistic rubric. There's only one scale here. Paragraph has a focus sentence, details, and conclusion, plus it includes a particularly compelling response to the prompt. For example, with especially vivid details. And then you back off from that. Notice that 3, focus sentence, details, and conclusion, that would be your proficient level, and that is exactly what the lesson was asking for. And then 2 and 1 are below that. So here's an example of a paragraph. If you were lost in a forest, what would you do? What things could you use to help you? And the student writes, and they were instructed to write the Q&A, so it's not indented like a paragraph because that's what they were told to do. If I was lost in a forest, I would stay calm and try to find the nearest house or ranger station because there's phones there. Also, I might stay in one spot so someone can find me easier. Would use sticks to make loud noises so animal predators do not come near me. Use leaves and dead branches to make a shelter. Find rocks to throw at nuts in a tree so I have something to snack on. I will also use some tinder to make a fire. That's what I would do if I was lost in the forest. Now, that's going to end up being a 3, and you don't know this, but all of those details are definitely details. They're definitely descriptive, but they are also all very derivative of source material that the students had been reading. So there's not any big original thinking there, and this paragraph looked a lot like everybody else's paragraph. So it would get, but it does have a focus sentence, it does have lots of nice details, and it does have a conclusion. In this case, that's what I would do if I was lost in the forest. So sometimes if you can use a template, that makes a kind of straightforward way to write a rubric, so you're not left grabbing for language, which some people don't like about trying to write rubrics. It really is a genre of writing that is, well, it's another genre of writing that your high school English teacher didn't teach you. Let's just say that. For simple tasks, sometimes there isn't an advanced level. The task may be either you do it right or you do it some degrees of not so right. There is a template for that kind of task. Again, don't use it as is. Don't say the task is complete and correct. Say whatever it is that you want the task to be. So, here is an example. The kindergartners were learning that you can make equal sets for numbers. Like if I had 3 in 3 circles, I could make an equal set by making another set with 3 circles. The students had been taught that to do that, you organize your sets in a single line. There needs to be a one-to-one correspondence between elements of each set. Now, the kindergartners, of course, didn't see these rubrics because they can't read, so this is in teacher language. But they had been taught that the way to check that your sets were equal to set it up so that you could match what was in one set with what was in the other set. And that would be complete and correct and proficient, and there's really no way to make it any better than that. So there is no 4. There's an attempt at organizing elements of each set. You can see that there had been some thought given to some organization that would get to equal sets, but was not entirely successful. And elements of each set are not organized would be the one that the student doesn't show any evidence that they can get their sets organized to see if they match. So let's look at some student work on that one. So student A is making a set of 4 and another equal set of 4. Most people, when I use this in a workshop where I can actually ask people to rate them, we give this a 3. They're lined up, there's a one-to-one correspondence, they match, and the sets are in fact equal. Student B didn't do that. He lined up the 4 red circles, but the yellow circles are kind of crowded in and they're not in a line so that it's hard to see the match. But you would be hard-pressed to say there's no evidence that the student was thinking about sets being equal. There's clearly evidence with student B that he does see, or she, I don't know what the student was, whether the student was a boy or a girl, that does see that we're going for a match here and we're lining them up so that you can see the match. So most people would give that one a 2. Neither one of them are completely random circles all over the place. And the genius there was that you had a very straightforward rubric that described what you were looking at in such a way that it was easy to observe. Now this is my summary slide, so I get back on my soapbox, because I am here to tell you that when you work with teachers, they get in their head this idea that you shouldn't count things. But it is so much easier to write performance level descriptions when you do it that way, and so much easier to defend yourself when students or parents come and say, why did my student get a 2? That it is very hard behavior to stamp out. And I hope my 7th grade example has convinced you that this is penny wise and pound foolish, that you are hurting students in the process. I have other examples of that. I just picked one. It happens all the time. Even if you don't end up hurting students, the results from rubrics that have lots of criteria about surface level features and not good descriptions about the substance of the thinking end up giving you grades where who gets the high grades are the teacher pleasers. Now, I love teacher pleasers. I used to hope I had teacher pleasers in my class. But really, the reason you get up in the morning and go into your classroom is to help to teach students to think. So there is a way around the pain that some teachers think they will have if they switch to substantive descriptions of student thinking and of student learning. And that is, you use the rubrics during your instruction as well as to grade, so that students get used to looking at examples of work and they can say, okay, this is a good example of a well-written paragraph because this paragraph is not well-written because. And then by the time you use the rubrics for grading, the students have a good understanding of what those performance level descriptions mean. And I'm going to come back again to I'm checking my time here. I'm going to come back again to the reason that rubrics are important in the first place. It's not just because they're a way to get an evaluation, a grade for student work. Any one of a number of scoring schemes would work just fine for that, if it was just about what the teachers considered judgment was. The thing about rubrics is those descriptions which students can match to work, which students can try to figure out what they understand, and which students can then try to aim for and use to improve their own work. That's the genius of rubrics. And what's my final point there is, that the rubrics actually need to be matchable just like the tasks are. You're used to matching tasks to the learning outcome you want to measure. So if you want to know if students can design an experiment, you ask them to design an experiment. If you want to know if students can write a certain persuasive paragraph or whatever, you ask them to do that. It may be less obvious, but it is equally important that the rubrics, the criteria and the descriptions need to match those learning outcomes too. Because when the work goes home with the student and all that's left is the score on the rubric, if you haven't assessed the substance of the learning outcomes, the student knowledge and skills and thinking that that learning outcome gives, then you've knocked the stuffing out of your lovely task and you don't have evidence of student learning. So I think I'm almost exactly at time. I have left time for questions on purpose. I've seen questions rolling through the chat box, and I'm going to rely on my lovely facilitators, Adrian and her team, to sort them out for me. And I am going to look at them and answer them probably in the order I get them. Here's a question. It says, do you think rubrics should be used to convert the data into a single number or letter grade? If your rubrics are on summative assessments, like a project that counts, you're going to have to combine it with other data into a report card grade. The important thing, I should back up and say, I think in a perfect world there would be no grades. Students would just learn. I have actually written that several times. But when you have the scale that we have with lots of students and organized into classes, I understand that grades aren't going to go away soon. My issue would be if you need grades to, why did that question go away? If you need grades, your rubric to be grades, you need to combine it carefully with other grades because the numbers in rubrics are not the same as the numbers in percents. And so the best thing to do is convert them all to the same scale, whatever grading scale you use, ABC or advanced, proficient, and so on, whatever it is that you use. Convert them all individually, each project, each test, each whatever, and then combine them, because then you'll be in the apples to apples situation. There's a lot more to say mathematically about that, but I don't think this is the forum for that. But there are references for that, including a book I've written about rubrics and lots of others. Here's a question that all I need to do is say amen. Kate from Buffalo says, have students use rubrics to self-evaluate and for peer assessment? Yes. Your rubrics, if they're written in such a way that the students can understand them, they should be used for student self-evaluation for sure, and for peer assessment if it's appropriate, depending on who your kids are and what the assignment is, but always for self-evaluation. Always before they turn the work in, your rubrics should go with the assignment. If students know what it is that they're going to be evaluated on, that's good. They should be able to evaluate. Sometimes it's helpful to have them evaluate other work besides their own, anonymous work from last year, work you mock up, however you do it, so that they can actually learn what those performance level descriptions mean without the body heat of this is my work and I want it to be good, so that they actually learn. But yes, absolutely. All I need to do to that one is say amen and mark it answered. Here's one that says, why not include zeros? And it's about, I think, a question about, I've been using 4321 or something like that, 654321. There's no reason not to include zeros. Some rubrics are 3210 or 210. Mathematically, if you think of the distribution in a class, if you used a rubric that said 4321 and you graphed it, how many kids got 4s, how many got 3s, how many got 2s, how many got 1s, and you got a distribution. And then you regraded the same things with the exact same rubric, except this time you called it 3210. All that would happen for that graph is that it would be, I don't know if you can see my hands on this video, but that it would be shifted over 1. Well, from your point of view, over 1 this way. It would be the exact same distribution. You need to be careful mathematically when you're combining grades that you know what your scale is, if you're combining individual grades for report card grades. But there's no reason that it wouldn't even have to be 3210. It could be words. It could be proficient, almost proficient, not proficient. Um, there's there the math, the number isn't the issue. And what you need to do is agree with people that you teach with about how you're going to use, what sort of rubric scale you're going to use, so that your rubrics don't look a whole lot different scale-wise from other people's. But really, the genius of the rubrics is in the descriptions and not the numbers. And I think there's some other questions. Do you ever create a rubric that has 0 is one of the columns with 0 means not done or missing? Yes, sometimes. I hate to be, before you do that, make sure that there isn't also a description that you want to put there, like not done or missing, or something that is so incomprehensible as to be, or so confused as to be not comprehensible. But yes, you can do that. Somebody says before and during and after a lesson or activity. Absolutely. That's a version of what we were just saying about rubrics being necessary for learning. The rubrics being excellent for learning. By definition, before and during, after is too late. Before and during are when the learning takes place. So absolutely. Barbara from Florida says, can rubrics be used multiple times in one sitting? Yes. It would depend on, rubrics used in class are used in the context of some sort of lesson. So it would depend what you want your students to do in the lesson. But you can, for example, have students use a rubric to evaluate their own work, and then later on they're using the rubric to improve their work. Or they might evaluate their own work and then evaluate somebody else's. Or if this question means, can you use the same rubric on multiple times, meaning on multiple different assignments? Yes. The best rubrics are the ones that do generalize across multiple assignments, like the math problem solving rubric that I showed you earlier, or like which could be used on any math, show the work and explain your reasoning problem, or like a writing rubric, like the 6+1 trait rubric, where, or even more focused rubrics like a persuasive writing rubric. So anytime they do persuasive writing these, or a lab report rubric. The reason that using general rubrics across multiple assignments is cool is that what the students will do is start internalizing the criteria, which is exactly what you want them to do for their learning. They learn things like a good math problem is solved when I have a strategy for it. I can explain that strategy. My solution is consistent with that strategy. Do the computation right to get a good answer, and I label it, and then I can tell you what I did. And that is how you solve math problems. And if they use that rubric over and over, eventually they will learn how to solve problems that way, because that will be their approach. Here's a question about rubrics for comprehension skills for reading. There are lots of ways to measure reading comprehension. A typical one is to use some sort of comprehension. If we're just talking about comprehension, not analyzing author's purpose or anything like that. Sometimes people use a comprehension test and use not a rubric, but a comprehension quiz or test on a passage for reading. I have seen some rubrics for comprehension skills for reading for students that are essentially reading rubrics about retelling, so that the student can explain a story and the beginning, middle, and end are clear and in order. Where rubrics will really help you for reading is in analysis, or in evaluation. If you're trying to decide, for instance, was this a particularly compelling story that would motivate you or another reader to go out and get a dog, or to go out and form a recycling team or something. Because typically that sort of work requires open-ended tasks that really you couldn't grade with a test like. So yes, I have seen rubrics for reading, although if you're talking about just straight up comprehension in the Bloom sense, a test is a perfectly good way to do that as well. This is an interesting question. Christina from Michigan. Are we assuming if the teacher creates a poor rubric, the students' projects will also be poor? Not necessarily, but likely. For instance, those two poor 7th grade inclusion students that I showed you apparently did their work without much reference, well, at least the one did, without much reference to the rubric. But a student who really studies the rubric and notices that that poor rubric it's really about counting facts. So I need to go out and get a bunch of facts because she's going to count how many facts I have. And it's about going and getting pictures because she's going to count how many pictures I have. And you absolutely might get more wooden, less thoughtful work for students that actually study the rubrics. Because many students will give you exactly what you ask for. And that's what they should do because you're their teacher and they should try to do what you ask. So it doesn't follow necessarily that if a teacher creates a poor rubric, the students' projects will also be poor, but it's likely that many of them will be way less than they could have been. And what is for certain is that some students will be harmed. Students who don't pay much attention to the rubric but actually learn something will not be able to show it on the rubrics. Here's an interesting one. Do you have guidelines you use to set the grading values in rubric? Yes and no. The guidelines I like to use are those. Only if you're going to have a 4-point rubric. It's perfectly okay to have a 6-point rubric. A 5-point rubric. If they get too long, you wouldn't want a 10-point rubric. That sounds to me like some sort of point scoring scheme waiting to be born. Because you probably couldn't make 10 judgments in quality, but you can make 4 or 6. I like to have a rubric template. Whoops, that's not the template. There we go, that's the template. I like to have a rubric that has acceptable behavior, acceptable performance, at not the top level. Because you need a place to put students who do more than just what is needed to pass or to get a B or to get a proficient or whatever you want. Now, for a little bit, you might end up with the teacher pleaser saying, wait a minute, I almost used to getting an A and I only got a B. That's an easy problem to solve. You use the rubric that's sitting right in front of the student to help them learn how to aim for that 4. Students who are used to trying to aim for the top will now have to aim for those exceptional insights or other feature that's above and beyond. Rubrics can actually help stretch students in that regard. Yes, sometimes I use guidelines, and they're often some version of this one, the slide that I just backed up to. Looks like we have time for maybe one more question. And so I'm going to flip through a couple of these to talk about some of them I've sort of addressed. Here's a good one. Do you recommend including students in creating the rubrics? And if so, what level would you suggest doing so? I do recommend including students in creating rubrics if it's something that they understand well enough to do. The best way to do that is to give them a bunch of work and let them sort it into high, medium, and low, and then let them describe what's good about the highs and what makes the others not as good. Brainstorm that and then organize those into criteria. And at what, if you mean by what level of student, there is actually some research evidence that first graders can do some of this. There is also some research evidence that says for the little kids, they will go for those surface level criteria. And it's more like about, well, second, maybe even third grade before they get the idea that, yes, it has to be neat, but that's not what we're doing here. We're learning how to write a certain kind of paragraph or something. And then, of course, up through high school. If it's a content area and skill that the students have never seen before, the way to involve students, instead of having them write what good work is and other levels of quality, because they really don't know, is to give them rubrics that you have written and have them translate them into their own words and have them match those own words versions with examples of student work. And that's how to get their head into the game. If it's a content area that they wouldn't know enough to write the rubrics. But if they do, and there are lots of those areas, yes, I absolutely recommend involving students.